The Radio Memories Network is brought to you in part by Liberated Syndication, podcast publishing made easy, libsyn.com. That's libsyn.com. Journeys into American history.
When Benjamin Franklin first set foot in London, he was just 18 years old. It was November 1724, and he'd been sent from the American colonies by the governor of Pennsylvania to buy printing equipment for a new Philadelphia newspaper. But when he arrived in London, it soon became clear that Franklin had been sent on a wild goose chase. There were no letters of credit or introduction, as he'd been promised by the governor. Franklin was devastated. The young printer had been cast adrift in what Daniel Defoe described as the great and monstrous thing of 18th century London. On the ship crossing over from America, Franklin had made the acquaintance of a Quaker merchant called Thomas Denham. Now, knowing no one else in London, the young man had sense enough to turn for help to his new friend, the older and more worldly wise merchant. Denham advised Franklin to make the best of a bad job and to gain more experience as a printer in London before returning home to America. So Ben Franklin took lodgings in Little Britain, near St. Bartholomew's Hospital. For a century and a half, this had been a street of printers and booksellers, and Franklin soon found himself employment with one of the 75 master printers in London.
I immediately got into work at Palmer's, then a famous printing house in Bartholomew Close, and here I continued near a year. I was pretty diligent, but spent a great deal of my earnings in going to plays and other places of amusement.
After a year, Franklin changed jobs, moving to a much larger firm just off Lincoln's Inn Fields. Previously, he'd been a compositor, whereas he now started at the lower grade of pressman, but he was a hard, honest and sober worker. He was also highly energetic. In the press room, for bodily exercise, he carried around double the large forms of type of his colleagues. This was noticed by his fellow workmen, who were surprised by the strength of this water American, as they called him. They believed that water made you weak, whereas strong beer naturally gave you strength. They had another reason for being startled by his drinking habits, bearing in mind the role of ale and beer in purifying water so that it could be drunk. Water was supplied from the Thames through leaking pipework, and though there were wells, these were used by a number of unhygienic trades, and like the river itself, were polluted. One can only assume that either Franklin's constitution could cope, or he found a cleaner source of supply. Franklin began to win over his colleagues. At least some of them gave up their breakfast of beer and joined Franklin in eating the far more wholesome porridge, sprinkled with pepper and breadcrumbs and with a bit of butter added. For those who continued with beer and who ran out of credit at the alehouse, Franklin lent them money at a decent rate of interest. He made sure that his debts were paid too, collecting them direct from the pay table on Saturday nights. Franklin found another way of raising money and of gaining himself an important introduction at the same time. In June 1725, he wrote to Sir Hans Sloane, a friend of Sir Isaac Newton, his successor as president of the Royal Society, and a great collector.
Sir, having lately been in the northern parts of America, I have brought from thence a purse made of the stone asbestos, a piece of the stone, and a piece of wood, the pithy part of which is of the same nature, and called by the inhabitants salamander cotton. As you are noted to be a lover of curiosities, I have informed you of these, and if you have any inclination to purchase them or see them, let me know your pleasure by a line directed for me at the Golden Fan in Little Britain, and I will wait upon you with them. I am, sir, your most humble servant, Benjamin Franklin.
The young printer was being extremely presumptuous, but his self-confidence worked. Sir Hans invited him to his house in Bloomsbury Square, where he showed him all his own curiosities and paid him handsomely for the purse. And it is fortuitous that he did buy it, for Sloane's magnificent collection was to provide a major part of the British Museum at its foundation in 1753. The purse is still there today. We are not told whether Sloane offered an introduction to Franklin's great hero, Sir Isaac Newton. Possibly, Franklin held back from such a meeting because Sir Isaac, though England's most celebrated intellect, was now in his 80s and increasingly frail. Although Ben Franklin himself was only 19, he was already showing an ability to gain personal access to people who shared his interests and enthusiasms, but who came from a more socially privileged background. Crucially, once having gained their attention, he was able to hold it, not through his oratory, but by being an engaged and attentive listener. Franklin also found time to read a great number of books, and he came up with a novel scheme that enabled him to afford to do so, as well as generating an important connection.
While I lodged in Little Britain, I made an acquaintance with a bookseller whose shop was at the next door. He had an immense collection of second-hand books. Circulating libraries were not then in use, but we agreed that on certain reasonable terms I might take, read, and return any of his books. This I esteemed a great advantage, and I made as much use of it as I could.
Although Franklin's London work concentrated on printing, he wrote one pamphlet of note. When staying after hours, he printed 100 copies of a work that he entitled A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain. It might have cost him his job, because although the author and printer were anonymous, had the pamphlet come to the attention of a magistrate and their identities been known, then its sentiments could have led to prosecution. Benjamin Franklin was the 10th-born son of a soap-maker from Boston, which was then the largest town in the American colonies. His father had emigrated from England 20 years before, and Ben always considered himself to be British. When he was 12, he was apprenticed to his elder brother James, who was a printer. Franklin loved reading, and his workplace gave him access to many new books and periodicals, and there was one collection which proved extremely important for his writing as well as his thinking.
About this time I met with an odd volume of The Spectator. I had never before seen any of them. I bought it, read it over and over, and was much delighted with it. I thought the writing excellent, and wished, if possible, to imitate it.
Franklin taught himself how to be a writer by recreating some of the articles from The Spectator. These essays were to serve as a model for his Silence Do-Good letters, the humorous wisdom of a worldly widow, which the 16-year-old Franklin began submitting to his brother anonymously. The letters were brilliantly written, and a tremendous mixture of spoof and mockery, combined with practical plans for improvement. They were so well received that they were soon the lead column on the paper's front page. After the 14th letter, Ben revealed himself as the author. His friends were greatly impressed, but brother James was not. After a series of arguments, Franklin decided to leave Boston and try his luck in Philadelphia, where he soon found work as a printer. The young Ben Franklin did not lack confidence and was undaunted when the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania sought him out. He proposed nothing less than to set up Franklin in his own business and to give him the official printing for the province of Pennsylvania. It was arranged that Ben would go to London to buy the equipment, and the governor offered to fund the entire business himself. But as Franklin discovered to his shock and dismay, when he arrived in London, there was no funding. London in the 1720s was going through a period of vibrant growth. 3/5 of the medieval city had been devastated by the Great Fire. It had engulfed the mansions on the city waterfront and destroyed many thousands of houses, along with guild halls, parish churches, and St. Paul's Cathedral. After the fire, the streets were made wider, and the new buildings were constructed chiefly of brick instead of the old timber and plaster. When Franklin arrived, the City of London still had that sense of newness, with St. Paul's finally completed in the decade before, and the red brick of the new houses being better than stone at resisting the discoloration from sooty fires and grime. But though the streets were wider, there were more of them. The result was the creation of a maze of alleyways, potentially fruitful for robbers. A Swiss visitor was shocked by the amount of London crime.
Quite lately, a valuable snuff box was stolen from me. I had placed it in the pocket of my carefully buttoned waistcoat. My coat was buttoned likewise, and I was holding both my hands over the pockets of my coat.
In spite of the savage penalties, some of the felons were career criminals. Others were driven by desperation. Luxury trades, such as tailoring, silk weaving, and cabinet making, were highly seasonal. Fortunately for Franklin, printing was less badly affected. A pressman was a skilled worker, earning 18 shillings a week, while a compositor could expect a guinea or more. But Franklin was not an obvious target for the robbers, being sober in dress and behaviour as well as young and muscular. He was also very fit. He swam the nearly 3 miles along the Thames from Chelsea to Blackfriars, which he did,
whilst performing on the way many feats of activity both upon and under water that surprised and pleased those to whom they were novelties.
Franklin was earning more and living frugally, but he was still worried about money. He planned to travel around Europe, picking up printing work here and there. However, his friend, the avuncular merchant Thomas Denham, advised against it. Better than that, he offered Franklin a job, helping to prepare and run a new store back in Philadelphia that came with the expectation of Franklin first becoming a mercantile agent and then, in time, Denham's junior partner.
I immediately agreed on the terms of £50 a year, Pennsylvania money. Less, indeed, than my then gettings as a compositor, but affording a better prospect.
Denham also lent him the fare home. After 19 months, Franklin's youthful sojourn in London was at an end. In July 1726, Franklin and Denham were on board the Berkshire and bound for Philadelphia. Franklin had a long time to collect his thoughts, because contrary winds turned a journey that might have taken 5 weeks into one of 13. On the Berkshire, Franklin's analytical and practical mind focused on the world around him. In his journal of the voyage, he took note of the bird and marine life, spending hours watching schools of dolphins. He witnessed 2 eclipses, first of the sun and then of the moon. But the length of the voyage also gave him plenty of time for introspection and for Franklin to create his plan of conduct. Its essence is distilled in 4 short principles.
1. It is necessary for me to be extremely frugal for some time, till I have paid what I owe. 2. To endeavour to speak truth in every instance, to give nobody expectations that are not likely to be answered, but aim at sincerity in every word and action, the most amiable excellence in a rational being. 3. To apply myself industriously to whatever business I take in hand, and not divert my mind from my business by any foolish project of growing suddenly rich, for industry and patience are the surest means of plenty. 4. I resolve to speak ill of no man whatever, not even in a matter of truth, but rather by some means excuse the faults I hear charged upon others, and upon proper occasions speak all the good I know of everybody.
Many years later, on reviewing the plan, Franklin acknowledged its importance and was rather impressed with his junior self. On occasion, he would find it impossible to adhere to his own high standards. It was, however, the starting point for an extraordinary transformation. On his next transatlantic voyage, just over 3 decades later, Benjamin Franklin was to return to Britain as a politician of importance in America, a best-selling author, an inventor, and a scientist of international fame. Benjamin Franklin's return to England in 1757 was rather different from his maiden voyage as a teenager more than 30 years earlier. During his 3 decades back in Philadelphia, Franklin had become a highly successful printer, journalist, and newspaper publisher. He was also an elected member of the Pennsylvania Assembly and the Deputy Postmaster General for North America. The future of the colony of Pennsylvania was under serious threat because an assault by French forces and their Indian allies was a real possibility. Money was needed urgently by the Assembly to buy arms and to raise a militia to defend themselves, but it was being vetoed by the proprietors of the colony, the Penn family in London. The Royal Society had recently awarded Benjamin Franklin its highest medal for his experiments with electricity and his invention of the lightning conductor. So it was no surprise that it was Franklin whom the Pennsylvania Assembly authorized to travel to London to address their concerns to Thomas Penn directly. This time, Franklin traveled in style. He had his 26-year-old son, William, with him for company, along with Franklin's personal household slave, Peter, and William's slave, whom they called King. They boarded the mailboat General Wall in June 1757 and set sail for Falmouth. Writing 30 years later, Franklin recaptured his sense of relief when the harbour came into view.
About 9 o'clock the fog began to rise and seemed to be lifted up from the water like the curtain at a playhouse, discovering underneath the town of Falmouth, the vessels in its harbour, and the fields that surrounded it. A most pleasing spectacle to those who had been so long without any other prospects than the uniform view of a vacant ocean.
Once they had arrived in London, the Franklin foursome of father, son, and their 2 slaves settled into the comfortable lodgings of a widow named Margaret Stevenson. Franklin found her to be both
very diligent and very obliging.
Indeed, Margaret was still his landlady when he finally left England 18 years later. Number 7 Craven Street was in an excellent location, not far from Whitehall and to the south of the Strand. The accommodation suited the Franklins very well. Ben described it as
4 rooms furnished, and everything about us pretty genteel.
He did, however, complain about London in general, saying it was in every respect very expensive. But then one reason for that was because he felt it necessary to rent his own carriage at the extravagant rate of 12 guineas per month. He felt the common vehicles for hire did not provide him with an option.
Hackney coaches at this end of the town, where most people keep their own, are the worst in the whole city. Miserable, dirty, broken, shabby things, unfit to go into when dressed clean, and such as one would be ashamed to get out of at any gentleman's door.
As for walking to appointments, the dirt of the streets, together with safety considerations, made it an extremely unappealing proposition for someone of Franklin's age and eminence. London was very different to the city Franklin had left over 30 years before, and the 1750s were a decade of great change. Major improvements in London's infrastructure were transforming the city. There was also a cultural change, a greater celebration of knowledge and scientific invention. The British Museum had been founded in 1753, and London was gaining the sort of institutions commensurate with its status as the greatest city in the world. The artist William Hogarth's famous print, Gin Lane, has wrongly been seen as representative of the 18th century as a whole in depicting the worst of London street life, but its publication came towards the end of the craze for the cheaper version of the spirit, which Dr. Johnson described in his dictionary as
a distilled spirituous water, made with no better an ingredient than oil of turpentine.
The great lexicographer was known to speak his mind, and he did not hold back from confrontation with anyone whose opinions differed from his own. However, we know that Dr. Johnson and Benjamin Franklin did actually meet on at least one occasion. The idea of such an encounter is the sort of thing to make a playwright's eyes light up. However, the reality was rather different. In all likelihood, aside from some opening pleasantries, there was little verbal communication between the 2 men. They met, with 6 others, at a committee meeting, and Dr. Johnson, satisfied with the work of Franklin and others, never attended again. What the 2 men had in common on this occasion had nothing to do with them both being brilliant writers, but their common humanitarian interest in the cause that the committee promoted. It was the education of young black men. Dr. Johnson had a personal interest because Francis Barber, his servant, adopted son, and finally his principal beneficiary, was black. As for Franklin, he was instrumental in setting up a number of special schools to further black education. He was true to his principles, for when his son William's slave, King, absconded and was found to be in the good care of a Suffolk lady who was paying for his lessons and teaching him the violin and French horn, the Franklins were happy to leave him there. Ben Franklin's slave Peter, on the other hand, settled into London much better and soon got to know the city through running his errands. Surprisingly, he would not have been at all conspicuous as a black person, because it has been estimated that there were 15,000 people of African origin living in London at that time. There is still one great unknown in Benjamin Franklin's personal life, the identity of the mother of his illegitimate son, William, who was born sometime around the end of 1730. Franklin's official version was that he and Deborah, the daughter of his landlady in Philadelphia, had agreed to marry before he set off for London when he was 18, but she had then married someone else who abandoned her a few years later. Franklin nobly picked up the pieces and, as Deborah was still technically married, took her as his common-law wife in 1730. Franklin's first meeting with Thomas Penn amounted to no more than an exchange of surface pleasantries. This was obviously a tactic. The Penn family had been warned that the popularity of Franklin's character and his reputation could make him a dangerous enemy. But Thomas Penn was not so concerned, dismissing him as the electrician.
Mr. Franklin's popularity is nothing here, and he will be looked very coldly upon by great people. There are very few of any consequence that have heard of his electrical experiments, those matters being attended to by a particular set of people, many of whom of the greatest consequence I know well. But it is quite another sort of people who are to determine the dispute between us.
Penn may well have been right about that, but he was certainly not prepared to risk giving Franklin the opportunity to prove him wrong. Thus, by the time the Assembly's new representative arrived in London, Penn had spent many months preparing the ground. He was to be given assistance by the normally sure-footed Benjamin Franklin himself. Franklin finally presented his list of complaints to Thomas Penn on behalf of the Pennsylvania Assembly. They were threefold: the proprietors' distant control over their lieutenant governors, the vetoing of the Assembly's money bills, even in time of emergency, and the exemption of the proprietors' estates from tax. From the informality of style, it is obvious that Franklin presented the complaints as a short discussion paper. But Thomas Penn chose to treat it as a formal document. He put the matter in the hands of his solicitor, with the instruction to seek a legal opinion from the government's law officer, the Attorney General. This would take many months. Franklin, the master tactician, had been completely outwitted. One might wonder why Franklin had been outmaneuvered so spectacularly. However, there is one likely reason. He was suffering from the early symptoms of malaria. Franklin was laid low with what he thought initially to be
a violent cold and something of a fever. It was not long before I had another severe cold, attended by great pain in my head, the top of which was very hot, and when the pain went off, very sore and tender. These fits of pain continued seldom less than 12 hours, and once 36 hours. I was now and then a little delirious. They cupped me on the back of the head, which seemed to ease me for the present.
Franklin did not know the insect cause of his ailment, but it seems extremely likely that he was the victim of one of the mosquitoes that bred in the marshlands of Westminster and Lambeth. His physician cannot be blamed for the slowness in administering the right treatment. When presented with these cold-like symptoms, the doctor would not normally have prescribed Jesuit's bark, as it was known, from its use by Catholic missionaries in South America, because it was experimental and highly expensive. However, we now have the advantage of knowing that it was the best available thing to provide.
I took so much bark in various ways that I began to abhor it. I durst not take a vomit for fear of my head. But at last I was seized one morning with a vomiting and purging, the latter of which continued the greater part of the day, and I believe was a kind of crisis to the distemper, carrying it clear off. For ever since I feel quite lightsome, and am every day gathering strength.
Franklin amended his last will and testament over the years, but one thing did not change: his description of himself as printer. Rightly so, as printing was the foundation for his later success. As a young man in Philadelphia, he had found a lack of duplicate letters, and rather than wait for replacements from England, he had created the moulds and then the letters himself. He was therefore, in this small way, the first manufacturer of type in North America. Once he was in business for himself, Franklin had one massive advantage as a printer. He was personally able to supply excellent copy. He took over a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and under his stewardship made it better than anything seen before in the colonies, with a number of firsts, including the first American political cartoon. Franklin was also the author of the hugely popular Poor Richard's Almanac, which he wrote under the pseudonym of Richard Saunders. First published in 1733, it contained local information and interesting facts, blended with humorous articles and aphorisms, known as Poor Richard's Proverbs. Two of the best known,
Necessity never made a good bargain.
and
3 may keep a secret, if 2 of them are dead.
were both in the first almanac. But over a quarter of a century, Franklin published dozens of other well-known sayings in Poor Richard.
Forewarned is forearmed. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. God helps them that help themselves. There are no gains without pains.
One of his purported aphorisms, "A penny saved is a penny earned," was actually,
A penny saved is a penny got.
and is a rare case where his original saying has been improved by posterity. Normally, he fine-tuned the work of others. However, these sayings have skewed the public perception of him, right down to the present. Franklin is still quoted on a daily basis, although his most famous quote of all,
In this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes.
did not appear in Poor Richard, but in a letter to a friend. More significantly, the huge sales of Poor Richard were a notable part of the business success that enabled Benjamin Franklin to retire and thus concentrate on the scientific work, for which he wished to be remembered. During his next 2 decades in London, he would cement his reputation as one of the leading scientists and inventors of his generation. By the time he was 51, on his return to London, Benjamin Franklin had every justification for holding an extremely high opinion of himself. His success in the field of physics, and specifically in that of electricity, had won him an astounding international reputation. The most celebrated popular image of Franklin the scientist is of his kite experiment in 1752, designed to draw electricity from the clouds and safely take it down to Earth. That image became common currency when it was printed on United States banknotes. However, his kite experiment was not the starting point for Franklin's extraordinary fame. It followed other experiments already undertaken in France, some of which were successful, some fatally so to those involved. Little wonder that crowds enjoyed this new phenomenon of seeing the sparks fly, because this playing with fire could have dire consequences if things went wrong. Franklin was honest enough to confess what happened when he was about to kill a turkey by electric shock, believing it would make the meat more tender. Distracted for a moment, he managed to put a shock through himself instead. There was a flash and a crack, neither of which he saw personally or heard, as the numbing was so quick.
My breastbone was sore for a week after, as if it had been bruised. What the consequence would be, if such a shock were taken through the head, I know not.
He was more careful after that. Franklin only began to gain proper recognition when his own reports of his experiments were published in London and Paris. In both editions, men of science were invited to try out the experiments for themselves, and the French were the first to take up the challenge. They already knew about electrical conduction. The king's official experimenter had demonstrated it to Louis XV by linking together 180 members of the Royal Guard and passing a charge through them, the sort of hair-raising entertainment that was popular at Versailles. Later, he repeated the experiment and made over 200 Carthusian monks leap into the air simultaneously. The French tested Franklin's experiment, and it worked. When the results were reported in the London papers, Franklin was awarded the Royal Society's highest honour, the Copley Medal. In no time at all, His admirers were using the terms philosopher and genius. This was about more than his invention of the lightning conductor. The colonial American had made a major breakthrough in theoretical physics that identified the two kinds of electricity as positive and negative. He had introduced names and concepts still in use today, such as battery, charge, conductor, plus, minus, and many more. Greater even than that, his theories provided the starting point for the later industrialization and then domestication of electrical power, which would revolutionize everyday life. The Oxford English Dictionary notes that the first figurative use of the word electrify, as in to startle, rouse, excite, as though with an electric shock, dates to 1752, the year when Franklin's scientific eminence was recognized. The area that interested Franklin for its own sake was scientific discovery and its practical application. He proudly refused to patent any of his many inventions, including the lightning conductor.
As we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously.
By the beginning of 1758, Ben Franklin had recovered from his bout of malaria. His illness had proved to be a liberating experience for his son William, who was staying with him in London. Unable to leave his sickbed, Franklin had been reliant on William to continue his dispute with the Penn family, the proprietors of Pennsylvania, going about the city, assessing their political maneuverings, and reporting back on the Penns' whispering campaign against him. William also had to pay attention to his legal studies at Middle Temple, but the law was not uppermost in his thoughts in London. He may have been in his late 20s, but he had a youthful exhilaration in coming from the periphery of the British Empire to the heart of its capital city. In a letter home to Philadelphia, William showed that he was having a tremendous time.
I've been busy with frequent engagements among politicians, philosophers, and men of business, and making acquaintances with such men as have it in their power to be of service in settling our unhappy provincial disputes.
He was also advancing socially. There had been a visit to Windsor and trips to the country, and he provides a lengthy description of the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens on the south bank of the Thames, which was the place for the beau monde to see and be seen.
The enchanting scenes at Vauxhall is another theme on which I could dwell for hours together. The many agreeable walks amidst rows of beauteous trees lighted with lamps, the elegant paintings and sculpture with which the boxes, the grand hall, and orchestra are adorned, the curious artificial fall of water, the ravishing music, vocal and instrumental, and the gaiety and brilliancy of the company would have made you conceive yourself in a situation beyond even the Elysium of the ancients.
Benjamin Franklin certainly nursed a healthy ego and took great pride in the fact that, though he was the youngest son of the family, he was conspicuously the most successful. He had long taken an interest in his family's English ancestors, and in the summer of 1758 he travelled with William to Northamptonshire to discover more about them. He did find one living relative in Wellingborough, who was weak with age, but very glad to re-establish contact with the American branch of the family. Next, he paid a visit to his father's birthplace at Ecton. On reading the parish register, Franklin was delighted to trace his descent through 2 centuries and to learn that he was actually the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations, rather than a mere 2. He joked that, had there originally been any estate in the family, no one could have stood a worse chance of inheriting it. The vicar's wife directed them to the moss-covered gravestones and provided a hard brush and basin of water so they could scrub them clean. There was one English family, the Stevensons, who emotionally meant far more to him than his many blood relations. His landlady at Craven Street, Margaret Stevenson, had taken on the management role that his wife, Deborah, had fulfilled for him back in Philadelphia. Such is the reputation of the 18th century, a time when for form's sake King George II felt obliged to take a royal mistress, though he did not really want one, that some assume Franklin and Mrs. Stevenson must have had a physical relationship. However, there is no evidence that they did. Franklin had sown wild oats in his youth, but he had settled for a matrimonial bliss with Deborah that matured into a mutual reliance, a very deep friendship combined with a partnership in management. This is what he recreated with Margaret Stephenson. He was able to treat Craven Street as his home, with Margaret managing it for him, and to enjoy a domestic life. His wife Deborah had not accompanied him to London because of her fear of seagoing, and Franklin knew she would never do so. It was not an excuse on her part, but a quite understandable phobia, and it was reinforced by the real hazards of 18th century sea voyages. There has also been much speculation about Franklin's relationship with Margaret Stephenson's daughter Polly, who was 18 when Franklin arrived in London. He may have been flirtatious in his relationships with young women, but it is fair to say that he would have run a mile had any of them suggested anything more than that. He acted more as a mentor. That was certainly the case with Polly, who might be called his star pupil. Although Polly spent much of her time living with an elderly aunt, Franklin became very fond of her. This matured from something avuncular to fondly paternal. Polly was a remarkable young woman, bright and highly literate, but what marks her out is her extraordinary thirst for knowledge. She came up with a brilliant scheme for ensuring a regular and entertaining correspondence with her mother's famous houseguest. One area where she felt herself to be less than knowledgeable was that of natural philosophy. She suggested that Franklin teach her. He greatly enjoyed their correspondence. Franklin's interest in science during his time in London was constant. He continued to conduct practical experiments, such as his demonstration of an electrical apparatus he called his Philadelphia machine, which obliged him by producing a spark 9 inches long. He also produced a damper for chimneys and stoves, and he created the first map to chart the Gulf Stream, but on the whole his science in London was theoretical and speculative. He did, though, definitely invent 2 noteworthy physical items. One was a 3-wheel clock, the other being the glass harmonica. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Franklin's clock was that the larger of its 2 faces would show only 4 hours. Thus, when the single hand was on the hour 1, it would also be on the hours 5 and 9, the assumption being that the viewer would be sufficiently compos mentis to realize which of the 3 was appropriate. The whole design was a combination of style, simplicity, and efficiency. Franklin also had a general love of music and applied his practical skill to create a new musical instrument, which he called the armonica, in honor of armonia, the Italian word for harmony, as he believed it to be peculiarly adapted to Italian music. He thought it suitable for playing the softest of the Scottish folk tunes, which he adored. The harmonica consisted of 25 glass bowls linked together with a spindle, rotated with a treadle, and played with fingertips. He was very proud of his instrument, believing its tones to be
incomparably sweet, beyond those of any other.
The harmonica was more than a curiosity. Its potential as an instrument for chamber music was quickly appreciated, and a great number of composers, including Mozart and Beethoven, produced pieces for it. In his role as Deputy Postmaster for America, Franklin had traveled vast distances across the colonies in his quest to determine the shortest postal routes. As ever, he'd been able to invent a practical aid to help him. It was a means of measuring the number of turns made by a wheel of his carriage, and it was through this device that the mileometer was born. Franklin is also often described as the inventor of bifocals, but there is no definitive evidence either way. It is known that he commissioned bifocals when he was living in France, but he may already have known about their use by artists such as Sir Joshua Reynolds. However, it can be said that he first introduced bifocals into America, popularizing them after he returned there. By then, such was his reputation as a scientist and inventor that it would have been natural for his fellow countrymen to credit yet another accomplishment to his name. In November 1758, 15 months after Franklin had delivered the Pennsylvania Assembly's list of complaints to Thomas Penn, the Attorney General at last felt that sufficient time had elapsed for him to give his legal advice. His response not only dismissed their complaints in full, but repudiated the bearer, Benjamin Franklin. The next day, the Penn family sent their own letter to the Assembly. They attacked the slipshod nature of Franklin's paper and added that he had been disrespectful towards them. The intention was clear. They were refusing to have anything further to do with Franklin, and they wished him to be recalled in disgrace. It was the end of Franklin's formal contact with the Penns, but he was certainly not recalled to Philadelphia. Now that direct communication with the proprietors was at an end, Franklin would have to approach the British government on the Assembly's behalf. But that was not inappropriate, because Franklin had come to a conclusion that Pennsylvania must throw off the Penns altogether and become a crown colony. By the early 1760s, Benjamin Franklin was moving in the most important social circles in London. Thomas Penn might have dismissed Franklin as the electrician, but many others clearly did not. Far from being treated coldly, Franklin was welcomed with open arms by those interested in natural philosophy and science, whether they were aristocrats or commoners. The Royal Society was one of half a dozen philosophical clubs, of which Franklin was a regular attender, as either member or guest during his time in London. They were all organised on the same basis, that of small groups who met with their friends in the supper rooms of favoured hostelries. Franklin was in his element. Here he was, with the men he regarded as the greatest minds in the capital of the world's greatest empire. More to the point, he was having fun.
I find I love company, chat, a laugh, a glass, and even a song as well as ever, and at the same time relish better than I used to do the grave observations and wise sentences of old men's conversation.
His two favourite venues were the Monday Club at the George and Vulture and the Club of Honest Whigs, which met at St. Paul's Coffee House. When he was away, he missed them.
The Monday scarce comes round, but I think of you, and am present with you in spirit, and shall take it kindly if, when you are not crowded, you would order a chair for me, and only caution one another not to tread upon my toes.
Among the other Monday Club members was the explorer and navigator, Captain James Cook. When Franklin was told of the death in Hawaii of that great and useful man and our amiable clubmate, he asked a friend to get him a good print of the late captain with the comment,
"I should be glad to have it, being personally acquainted with him."
As to the atmosphere at the Club of Honest Whigs, no less a source than Dr. Johnson's biographer, James Boswell, provides a sketch following his own attendance.
It meets every other Thursday at St. Paul's Coffee House. It consists of clergymen, physicians, and several other professions. We have wine and punch upon the table. Some of us smoke a pipe. Conversation goes on pretty formally, sometimes sensibly and sometimes furiously. At 9 there is a sideboard with Welsh rabbits and apple puffs, porter and beer. Our reckoning is about 18 pence a head.
Just as the population of London had surged during the 1700s, so had the supply of food to feed it. A dinner with guests would consist of 2 courses, each with at least 2 or 3 dishes. The first would include soup, which would be followed by a fish dish. The second course would also include a greater number of sweeter assortments. The dishes were sampled tapas or meze style, with the guests encouraged by the hostess to take or leave whatever they wanted. In addition, there might be a dessert, a feast for the eyes as well as the palate, with fruits, jellies, and other sweetmeats set out in pyramids on raised dishes. Meanwhile, the alcohol would continue to flow. Ben Franklin, more interested in conversation than intoxication, was more abstemious than some. But even during the 7 Years' War, French claret and brandy might be available with no questions asked, as well as the more patriotic port and Madeira. It is no wonder that Franklin piled on the pounds and began to refer to himself as
Dr. Fatsides.
After 3 years of haggling, the main financial dispute between the Pennsylvania Assembly and the Penn family was resolved. As far as Franklin was concerned, he was able to claim that he had fulfilled the most important part of his mission to England. It was of less concern to him that the Penns had negotiated all kinds of safeguards. for he was now convinced that a permanent solution would only come once Pennsylvania ceased to be a proprietary colony owned by the Penns and became a royal one. Franklin was not focused just on Pennsylvania, but had an eye to the interests of British America more generally. He believed in a country that could be peopled with a hard-working population of what he narrowly defined as Anglo-Saxons, not existing as a separate entity, but as part of an integrated and greater Britain.
Now I look on the colonies as so many counties gained to Great Britain, and more advantageous to it than if they had been joined to its land. For being in different climates, they afford greater variety of produce and materials for more manufactures. And being separated by the ocean, they increase much more its shipping and seamen. And since they are all included in the British Empire, the strength and wealth of the parts is the strength and wealth of the whole.
It was a clear-sighted vision. He saw just how America, with its vast lands, abundant resources, and a population doubling every 25 years, could contribute both to Britain's future and to that of proud Britons such as himself. Meanwhile, Franklin's son William seemed to be following in his father's footsteps. When Ben received an honorary doctorate from the University of Oxford in 1762, William also received an honorary M.A. on account of his learning in municipal law. However, the young man, now in his early 30s, was looking towards his own future and that of his potential wife. He had been courting a Miss Elizabeth Downes, who had the advantage of being very well connected. William now had the status of a gentleman and the charm and the skill to move within elevated social circles. Yet Ben Franklin was unhappy. He had hoped for the far less advantageous union of William with Polly Stevenson, the daughter of his landlady, one that would bind his young friend Polly more closely to himself. Ben was extremely ambitious for his son, but here he put his heart before his head. Ben could not deny that Elizabeth Downes was the better bet financially. She was the daughter of a rich Barbados planter, and though her father had died when she was very young, he had left her enough money for her refined education and £1,200 a year. She had a large family of wealthy uncles and aunts, and a home in the highly fashionable St. James's Street, aside from which Elizabeth was described by Ben himself as both
sensible and agreeable, and of so amiable a character.
Just as William's social future looked promising, so did his professional life, when, unexpectedly, the royal governorship of New Jersey fell vacant, and he was proposed as the replacement. It was a surprising appointment, particularly as William's principal qualifications from his time in London were merely a law degree and working for his father. William's confirmation came in August, the whole process moving so rapidly that the Penn family were unable to mount effective opposition. It was Ben himself who almost ruined his son's chances. After the announcement of William's appointment in the London Chronicle, one of Franklin's old enemies contacted Thomas Penn with a devastating secret. Surprisingly few in London knew about William's illegitimacy. It was something that Ben Franklin had tried to keep to himself. Thomas Penn obviously didn't know, or he would have used it before. However, Penn was too late, making his move 3 days after the Privy Council had given its formal approval of the appointment. All the same, William's illegitimacy was a matter that could not easily be brushed aside for a prominent servant of the Crown. Had another Franklin skeleton come to light during William's examination, then surely he would have failed, because it would have been considered a step too far. That was another case of sowing wild oats, this time by William himself, who had sired an illegitimate son of his own in London. He relied on his father to act discreetly and to place the boy in a good foster home and later to fund his education. Thus, even William's new bride did not discover the child's existence until 13 years later, by which time his grandfather had taken him to his heart. William's acceptance within society was officially confirmed by his marriage to Elizabeth Downes in September 1762 in the capital's most fashionable church, St. George's, Hanover Square. But surprisingly, his father was not there at the wedding. Ben Franklin had sailed from Portsmouth in the middle of August. It might seem strange that, having stayed for so long in England after the completion of his business with the Penns, he did not delay another month for his son's wedding. It has been suggested that one reason for his departure was that he could not bring himself to see William marry someone other than Polly, but he also had urgent business in Philadelphia. Franklin had invested a large sum of money within weeks of the accession of the new king, George III. At first his choice of investment had seemed inspired, but then things turned sour. He feared his enemies would accuse him of financial impropriety and ineptitude because the money was not his own, but Pennsylvania's. Not only was his honour and reputation at stake, but the Assembly also owed him thousands of pounds for his salary and the expenses he had accumulated in nearly 5 years in London. These were huge sums, giving him reason enough to return home at once. Franklin knew that his opponents in the Pennsylvania Assembly were preparing poisonous attacks to greet him on his return. The lieutenant governor summed up their general view.
I cannot find that Franklin's 5 years' negotiation at a vast expense to the province hath answered any other purpose with respect to the public than to get every point determined against them. Yet what is this to Mr. Franklin? Hath it not afforded him a life of pleasure, and an opportunity of displaying his talents among the virtuosi of various kingdoms and nations?
In the event, Franklin was not only reimbursed for his receipts in full, but given a further £3,000 for his time in London. As for the losses on his investments, they were also accepted. Once back in America, Franklin spent a great deal of time travelling to secure greater efficiencies in the postal service. But he was in Philadelphia to greet his son William, en route with his new wife to New Jersey, where he was to take up his appointment as the royal governor. The young Franklins had suffered a stormy sea crossing, one so bad that William told his mother,
"I would not wish the devil to experience a winter's passage like ours."
Franklin was also back in the Assembly, and it seemed an opportune time for him to press his case for royal government. But he faced big challenges. The accusation was made that Franklin's plan was principally conceived so that he would himself govern, either directly or through his son William, a charge that was made the stronger because of its plausibility. The whole debate rolled into that autumn's Assembly election campaign. Franklin's opponents threw everything they could at him in terms of his morals, his upbringing, and his social and political ambition. William's bastardy was raised once more, as was the accusation of his father's misappropriation of public funds during his time in England. The result, when it came, was close. Franklin lost his seat by just 19 votes, but he took the defeat philosophically. His party still held a healthy majority, and so Franklin was reappointed as the Assembly's agent and asked to return to England. He had missed being in London. While he was in Philadelphia, Franklin wrote to Polly,
Of all the enviable things England has, I envy it most its people. Why should that petty island, which compared to America is but like a stepping stone in a brook, scarce enough of it above water to keep one's shoes dry, why, I say, should that little island enjoy, in almost every neighbourhood, more sensible, virtuous, and elegant minds than we can collect in ranging 100 leagues of our vast forests?
The procession that escorted Franklin to the Delaware River was a loyal throng of around 300. A dozen supporters then rowed him out to his ship, the King of Prussia. He had already written his valedictory words of possibly taking his last leave of the country he loved. He was crossing back to his other world in London. Benjamin Franklin returned to his London home in Craven Street in 1764. He recounted with delight that his landlady, Mrs. Stevenson,
was a good deal surprised to find me in her parlour.
Soon all was as normal. He was back at his clubs or otherwise spending time with friends, keen as ever to invite him out to dinner with perhaps the promise of his favourite estate venison to tempt him. By reading Franklin's letters, and of course by looking at his portraits, we can tell that Franklin ate very well indeed. Though of course there was always the scourge of the overindulgent. Franklin was soon writing to a friend about
a visitation that confined me near a fortnight.
At the time, gout was generally seen to be an unavoidable consequence of good living. It was certainly known that claret, port, and Franklin's favourite Madeira were culprits. But what gentleman would want to be without them? Throughout his life, Franklin valued fresh air and exercise. Writing to his son William in 1772, after the New Jersey governor had suffered ill health in his 40s, Franklin stressed the importance of raising the heart rate.
In considering the different kinds of exercise, I have thought that the quantum of each is to be judged not by time or by distance, but by the degree of warmth it produces in the body. Thus, when I observe if I am cold when I get into a carriage in the morning, I may ride all day without being warmed by it. But if I am ever so cold on foot, I cannot walk an hour briskly without glowing from head to foot by the quickened circulation.
He also saw the benefit of step exercises, believing that
there is more value in walking 1 mile up and down stairs than in 5 on a level floor.
This was very much a case of do as I say, not as I do. Towards the end of his stay in London, Franklin was beginning to suffer the consequences of ignoring his own good advice. But he remained philosophical about the gout and the later additional agony caused by kidney stones.
People who live long, who will drink of the cup of life to the very bottom, must expect to meet with some of the usual dregs. And when I reflect on the number of terrible maladies human nature is subject to, I think myself favored in having to my share only the stone and the gout.
However, though he accepted the received wisdom on gout, Franklin rejected the general attitude towards ventilation. The commonly held view was that cold, fresh air should be kept out of rooms, but Franklin disagreed. He believed that fresh air should not only be allowed into a room, but also onto a person, and he took what he called air baths.
The cold bath has long been in vogue here as a tonic, but I have found it much more agreeable to my constitution to bathe in another element. I mean cold air. With this view, I rise early almost every morning, and sit in my chamber without any clothes whatever, half an hour or an hour, according to the season, either reading or writing. This practice is not in the least painful, but on the contrary agreeable. And if I return to bed afterwards, I make a supplement to my night's rest of 1 or 2 hours of the most pleasing sleep that can be imagined.
Franklin had returned to England with clear instructions from the Assembly to secure royal government for Pennsylvania. In November 1765, he formally petitioned the Privy Council and had every confidence of the petition's success. But it failed, if not totally so. The official record stated, "postponed for the present," which Thomas Penn construed as "forever and ever," and Franklin,
as soon as these other affairs are out of hand.
These affairs being the last knockings of the Stamp Act controversy. The Stamp Act had been introduced by the British government earlier that year. It did not just tax correspondence, but encompassed everything from legal papers to newspapers, calendars, and even playing cards. It was viewed by the colonies as a charge on the daily round of human activity, as virtually impossible to avoid and fundamentally unconstitutional. Franklin wrote to a colleague back in Philadelphia that there was no likelihood the government would repeal the act.
Depend upon it, good neighbor, I took every step in my power to prevent the passing of the Stamp Act. Nobody could be more concerned in interest than myself to oppose it, sincerely and heartily. But the tide was too strong against us. We might as well have hindered the sun setting. That we could not do.
There was uproar in North America. Across the colonies, groups were formed to resist the tax, and rioters destroyed the houses of senior government officials. A rumour spread that Franklin himself had helped to plan the act, and his own home was threatened by an unruly mob. Franklin was appalled at the suggestion that he had supported the act. He realised that he must actively take up the cause of repeal with the British government. Fortunately, he was in a position to do so. When a House of Commons committee was set up to investigate the matter, Franklin was a major witness. He gave a command performance. A sufficient number of MPs were convinced by his testimony that the colonies would naturally return to obedience if the Stamp Act were repealed, unless the alternative of military intervention was chosen, in which case he issued a stark warning.
The British troops will not find a rebellion. They may indeed make one.
The Stamp Act was repealed. When news reached Philadelphia, Ben Franklin was hailed as a hero. He had repaired a difficult situation for the government, but also for himself, and emerged to great acclaim. While Franklin was in London, his wife Deborah was living at the house in Philadelphia, keeping it in readiness for the day of her husband's return. But in a letter to his son William, Franklin confessed something that he could not conceivably have told Deborah. His decision to return to Philadelphia would ultimately not be due to any consideration he had for his wife. Instead, it would depend upon events.
A turn of a die may make a great difference in our affairs. We may be either promoted or discarded. One or the other seems likely soon to be the case, but it is hard to divine which.
In the end, it was the latter. After 3 years, Franklin received a final decision on Pennsylvania's future colonial status. His petition for royal government had been rejected. Thomas Penn's proprietary rule had survived, and Franklin and his supporters had lost. There was no way that he wanted to return to Philadelphia as a mere member of the Assembly of Pennsylvania, still under the grip of Thomas Penn. That would have been a humiliating step downward. His future was uncertain, but he still retained his position as agent for the Assembly in London, and he also continued as the deputy postmaster for America. Meanwhile, at home in Philadelphia, his wife's health was failing. Deborah had suffered a stroke. She wrote to him that she was fine really, and she had just collapsed through the stress of looking after sick and dying relations, low spirits, and of course, learning that her husband was going to stay away so much longer. She was refusing to accept that anything had changed, and so was her husband. Out of duty, he continued to write, but his letters lacked their usual spark. When she told him of lapses of memory or of physical infirmities, he ignored them, or told her of his own invigoration after a holiday. Franklin was now the agent in London for 4 colonies: Pennsylvania, Georgia, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. This gave him a considerably increased workload, and it is a fair question to ask why, at the age of 64, he took so much on. One explanation is that he did so for financial reasons. He needed money in order to continue his extravagant lifestyle in London. One can also conclude, however, that he relished the challenge of influencing events in the capital city. In January 1774, London received the news of the Boston Tea Party. Over 100 individuals, white men bizarrely and haphazardly disguised as Mohawk Indians, had dumped 340 chests of tea from 3 ships into Boston Harbor. Their open defiance of the British government's new Tea Act caused a sensation. The mood in London was one of outrage. At a dinner party in the spring, Franklin overheard a senior British colonel suggest the best way to treat American males and solve the crisis.
He proposed that with 1,000 British grenadiers, he would undertake to go from one end of America to the other and geld all the males, partly by force and partly by a little coaxing.
By December, it had been nearly a year since Franklin had received a letter from his wife. Finally, on Christmas Eve, 1774, William wrote to inform his father that she had died 3 days earlier.
Her death was no more than might be reasonably expected after the paralytic stroke she received some time ago, which greatly affected her memory and understanding. She told me that she never expected to see you unless you returned this winter, for that she was sure she should not live till next summer. I heartily wish you had happened to have come over in the fall, as I think her disappointment in that respect preyed a good deal on her spirits.
In short, she had finally lost hope of ever seeing her husband again, and given up. William went on to say that he was worried about his father's health and safety, and he could not understand the delay in returning home to his family. But Franklin was involved in negotiations. As the situation deteriorated in North America, members of the British government had turned to him in the belief that he had power to mediate on behalf of the colonies. Franklin did not, but he was willing to make suggestions. There was even talk of a breakthrough, with Franklin going to America along with Lord Howe as a peace commissioner. That initiative, however, fizzled out. Franklin was no longer of any political use in London. Within days, he was on board a ship to America, before a warrant could be issued for his arrest, something he knew that his enemies in high places had been seeking for months. Ultimately, Franklin had failed in both his missions to London. The Pennsylvania Assembly was not able to tax the proprietors on a permanent basis, nor was it able to oust them and establish Pennsylvania as a royal colony. But such a judgment is harsh. Franklin had failed, but it was not for want of trying. He himself, rather touchingly, summed up his efforts in July 1776 to Lord Howe, 16 days after the Declaration of Independence. Howe had just arrived in America, not as a peace broker, but as the British military commander-in-chief.
Long did I endeavour, with unfeigned and unwearied zeal, to preserve from breaking that fine and noble China vase, the British Empire. For I knew that, being once broken, the separate parts could not retain even their share of the strength or value that existed in the whole, and that a perfect reunion of those parts could scarce even be hoped for.
Ben Franklin became his new nation's first ambassador to France. When he returned home to Philadelphia in 1785, Franklin received a hero's welcome and took on the role of first citizen in a Pennsylvania that was now purged of the Penn family. After his death 5 years later, his many achievements in science, journalism, philosophy, and politics were compared to those of Leonardo da Vinci. As for Great Britain and America, commerce not only recovered after the American War of Independence, but was soon far greater. Benjamin Franklin's dream of a great British and American trading empire was still alive, except now it would be between two separate nations.